All of you to the New York Historical Society. In particular, I want to say how honored we are to count on our special guests today, Mayor de Blasio, First Lady McCrae, Chancellor Carranza, First Deputy Chancellor Harris, Deputy Chief Academic Officer Pendergast, and of course, Congressman Lewis, and all of you who have joined us today. We are thrilled to welcome so many dedicated educators to the New York Historical Society. It is your commitment to conveying the true values of our American democracy that forms the backbone of our public schools, of which I'm very proud to say my own children are graduates. Amen is right, and they're very successful too. For those of you who don't already know me, I'm Louise Mirror, the very proud person who gets to be called president of this splendid institution. And today I'm not only lucky, but also enormously proud to be part of the team led by our Vice President for Education, Mia Nagowicki, and our Director of Education, Leslie Hayes, hosting this important set of conversations. And what an extraordinary honor it is to be in the presence of Congressman Lewis, a man who has shown us all what it truly means to be an American. History is serious fun. That's the motto of our educational programs for young children and our Demetta Children's History Museum at New York Historical. We're thrilled that the theme of today's discussions around citizenship and democracy gives credence to that claim. Our own work at New York Historical always endeavors to delight as well as instruct, engaging thousands of green card holders in debate and discussion as they enjoy our collections while in the process of securing the constitutional protection they deserve by completing their path to citizenship. Educating our youngest New Yorkers around the long struggle for freedom and equality on the part of so much of New York's demographic, beginning with our landmark exhibition on slavery in New York and continuing with exhibitions and education programs like Nueva York, the history of Chinese in America, and most recently, the Stonewall riots and their aftermath, while also delighting in the wit and wisdom of speakers like our own First Lady, Shirlane McCrae, as she delivered the keynote address just a few weeks ago at an event honoring the Salsa Soul sisters and the lesbian Her Story archive on view now in New York Historical's galleries. There is no nook or cranny of our beautiful historic building or of our online presence or off-site programs that does not speak to the importance of education as well as the fun of learning. That is why it is such a great pleasure to work together with New York City's Department of Education on Civics for All, the flagship initiative of the DOE's leader, Chancellor Richard Carranza. It is no surprise to us at all that Chancellor Carranza is a once, and I'll say always, social studies teacher whose abiding love for history is at the heart of Civics for All. Chancellor Carranza has made quick work of adopting New York as his hometown and of seeing to it that our city's children flourish as other students have done during his tenure elsewhere. Under Mayor de Blasio's and Chancellor Carranza's leadership, New York City high schools today boast the highest graduation rate ever, and more of those high school graduates are attending college than at any other time. Distinguished guests, please join me in welcoming Chancellor Richard Carranza.
So good afternoon, everybody. I just have to say, Louise, that is the best pronunciation of my last name that I have heard in a long time. Carranza, es española. So I really appreciate it. How are you doing this afternoon? Good? I am incredibly thrilled to be here, not only with our first Deputy Chancellor, our Deputy Chief Academic Officer, all of my colleagues that are teachers that are in the room, and to the social studies department. As a former social studies teacher, I feel like I'm with my people. We've done the secret handshake, so we're all together in community. But a true honor to be here with the mayor, the first lady, the first son, I would say, and obviously the man of the hour. Someone who needs no introduction. I'll say a few things in just a minute about him. This is an incredible event. And for, I would say, the most important people in the room are students, are young adults. Congressman Lewis and I and the mayor and first lady had a chance to share some words before we came out. And I just have to tell the students that are here that he was bragging on you. He was talking about the intelligence of this new generation of Americans, freedom fighters. He was talking about how insightful you are. I don't want to take words out of his mouth because he will say it much better than I can, but let's just say we are most excited that you are here. As I stand before you, I'm reminded more than ever how important your voice is. Because in the corners of our democracy where some of the adults, some of us over the age of 40, and some of us over the age of 25, hey, you got the joke. That was a good one, right? Who just don't get it, you get it. You are making connections to what is right and just like that 19-year-old boy from Troy did way back when. So it's incredibly important that we as educators, the teachers all around you, your elected officials, and these incredible authors that you're about to meet equip you with the knowledge and arm you with the tools to raise your voice and make the change that you want in pursuit of democracy and freedom for all. There's no better example of that than the gentleman who you're about to meet, not only Congressman Lewis, but also our mayor, who has taken equity and excellence to a whole different level, not only in New York City, but as an example for school systems across the country. Our featured speaker has made history in many, many ways. And I'm incredibly excited that you will get a chance to hear from a living legend in his own words. We also are very, very excited that New York City has led the way in implementing these graphic novels as part of, not an addition to our social studies curriculum, but they are a cornerstone of our social studies curriculum. And we all know that what happens in New York is what very quickly will happen across the country. So I couldn't be prouder of our Central Social Studies team that has led the nation in using these graphic texts in our social studies curriculum, and the Civics for All team that has continued this work, including the addition of the March trilogy as part of our Civics for All text set. So I want to take just a minute to acknowledge them by name. And these are the members of our social studies team who put this day together. Nora Lovett, Brian Carlin, Joe Schmidt, Jenna Ryall, as well as the rest of the Civics for All team. Thank you. I also want to give a special shout out to Lucius Young and Larry Pendergast for their leadership in making sure this is embedded in our curriculum, and as well our First Deputy Chancellor, Cheryl Watson-Harris, who ensures that our schools have what they need to do the work that they need to do. I also want to thank, obviously, John Lewis. Thank you for being the hero that we need more than ever. Andrew Iden and Nate Powell for creating the timeless resources for us. And we are lucky to have them here with us today in person. So to our students, to our New York City students, get ready for an afternoon that will be incredibly powerful and uplifting, and it will be unforgettable. So with that, I have the incredible honor of introducing his honor. The man who is leading New York City to incredible heights, not only in education, but in all facets of government. Our mayor, my mayor, Mayor Bill de Blasio.
Thank you so much, Chancellor. Everybody, this is a very, very special moment for all of us. And I'm going to just say a few words about what it means. I want to thank the Chancellor to begin with, because he's someone who really believes in what we're talking about here today. He really believes in the power of all of you to make a difference in the ability to inspire each other to action, in the life-saving reality of civic involvement and activism. And it's very refreshing to have someone running the nation's largest school system, and I'll just put it in my own words. He's not hung up about this stuff. It is not difficult for him to imagine academic excellence walking hand in hand with civic involvement and activism. It's very natural for him. It's who he is. And it's part of what I think makes him a great chancellor. Let's thank Chancellor Carranza. To the educators in the room, a profound thank you to all of you. I want to say first a confession. Social studies was my favorite topic in school, okay, my favorite subject, okay. That's where all the cool kids hung out. That's all the cool teachers were the social studies teachers. I think we can all agree on this, right? So sometimes you study social studies and it really has an impact on you and you never kind of get away from it. You know, some of us are examples of that. So I thank all the social studies teachers, all the educators, everyone who finds this to be a passion. I really thank the students, because when you hear from John Lewis in a moment, you will feel the immediacy of this extraordinary man, and you will not feel like you're hearing about the history of a bygone era, because when you hear it in his voice, it feels like it's right now, because he was part of those movements and he's part of these movements right now. And by the way, Congressman Lewis, I'm going to have to praise you several times along the way, but I just want to especially say you were part of the most urgent and important movements half a century ago, and you're part of the urgent and most important movements right now. Thank you. And for Charlene and Dante and I, you know, just to even have a few moments to just hear directly from the Congressman what has animated him, why he maintains that extraordinary hope. It is so moving, it's so inspiring. We all need that. We need something to believe in troubled times, and to connect with people who maintain that hope, maintain that sense of fight and possibility is so extraordinary. But I also want to say, I don't think I'm taking liberties if I say one of the great lessons of the life of Congressman John Lewis is that he started out as an activist from a small town. He was not ordained. He was not someone who had privilege. He was someone who believed he could make a difference. And that is the beginning of the discussion. Every single human being can make a difference. So look around the room at all the change agents in this room. Give each other a round of applause, please. A special thank you to the folks who have made this a labor of love, the social studies and civics for all teams who believed that taking the March trilogy and making it a part of the curriculum could be life-changing for so many of our young people. I love that audacity. I want to thank you for your creativity. I also want to ask you, be proselytizers. We want every school system in America to do the same as what you're doing. So will you pledge to me right now? Raise your right hand. Pledge to me right now that you're going to convince all the other school systems to do the same thing. Are you with me? You going to spread the word? I can't hear you. All right. They're coming to life, Congressman. I'm warming them up for you. Two more acknowledgments. Louise, thank you for what you and everyone here at the Historical Society does. It's so important. This is really a living, breathing, active place. And thank you for your leadership. And then to our First Lady, I just want to say I keep learning about my wife's early activism. I knew a lot about it, but I keep reading articles that show me more about the worlds that she was a part of, in places like the Combahee River Collective. And I have to say that she and the other women in Combahee these were folks who were talking about intersectionality decades before it became fully understood in the larger culture. So Charlene, you always were a little ahead of your time. Thank you for all you do. So, a few quick points. I made the point about continuity of mission. And I want to say it this way about John Lewis. So it was 51 years ago he stood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. 51 years ago. And then, 51 years later, led the sit-in on the floor of the House of Representatives for gun safety laws. And neither of those things had been done before. That spirit of taking a movement someplace it had not been and believing that a whole new idea could be born, a whole new approach, that life and energy that a lifelong activist feels. It's extraordinarily inspirational. And it's a reminder not to limit ourselves. And I'm saying this about society, but I'm also saying it to the educators, I'm saying it to the students. One of the things I hope comes through today is to not let anyone rob you of your own power. Not let anyone talk you out of your own power. The truly great leaders understood that. And John Lewis, over and over again, has shown us what empowerment looks like. And we were just talking outside, and he used a phrase he is famous for. When people get in good trouble. It's a beautiful phrase. We want people to get in good trouble. So I want to be real clear that, there was a little controversy at the time of the climate strike. But I know Richard Carranza and I had no doubt in our mind. If thousands and thousands of New York City students believed that they had to take matters into their own hands and stand up to save the earth, we should be saying amen. We should not be holding them back. That is good trouble. When students fight for mental health services and restorative justice in their schools, that's good trouble. That's not to be held back. That's to be encouraged. And the March trilogy is good trouble because it's going to provoke thinking. It's going to get people feeling things that maybe a more traditional approach to education might not spark the same way. But this will spark people's hearts. It will spark their sense of possibility. So I just feel humbled to be in the presence, not just of someone great, but someone who taught us all about the greatness in ourselves and teaches us right now and will teach you today about the greatness in yourselves, the potential for change we all hold within. We just have to remember to believe in it. And with that, I have the great honor of introducing our panel today. And again, as I call them up, a thank you to all of you. A thank you for what you're doing. It will make and is making a huge, huge difference. So let me first call up the moderator. No panel is complete without the moderator. Dr. Uhuru Williams, a civil rights scholar. Doctor, thank you so much. Civil rights scholar and national expert on history curriculum. He has been a key advisor to the City of New York, helping us to build our Civics for All curriculum. Next, the co-authors of the March trilogy, and what they have done is having a huge impact on all those who read it. Let's welcome Andrew Iden and Nate Powell. Thank you, brother. Did I say Iden right? Okay. I had a moment where, is it Iden? Is that the right way to say it? It is. All right. Now for the moment we have waited for. Living legend. Mark these words. A living legend means someone who is a legend, who is living now and changing things right now. And that is our honored guest, and all of New York City welcomes you, Congressman John Lewis.
party. Well, no, the stage is yours.
Mr. Mayor, thank you very much. Chancellor, thank you. To all of the teachers, to all of the students, thank you for allowing us to be here. Now, I'm just a poor boy who grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little town called Troy. I know there is a Troy, New York, right? But I grew up outside of Troy, Alabama. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But back in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and a man sold him 110 acres of land for $300. My family still owns this land today. On this farm, we raise a lot of cotton and corn, lots of peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. I won't bore you with it. But I fell in love with raising chickens as a little child, as a little boy. Any of you students know about raising chickens? You know, you had to raise chicken? So you know something about raising chicken? In your school? Well, why don't we compare notes? Well, as a little boy, when the setting hen was set, had to take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. You may be saying, now, why do you mark the fresh egg with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest, and there would be some more fresh eggs, and they had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. Do you follow me? So when these little chicks were hatched, I would fool these setting hens. I would take these little chicks and give them to another hen and get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, and encourage the setting hen to stay on their nest for another 3 weeks. I was never quite able to save $18.98 to order the most inexpensive incubator, a hatcher from the Cincinnati Roebuck store. Now, maybe in New York City, you never saw a Cincinnati Roebuck store, a shopping store where you go and buy things. And we would get order things from there. But as a little boy, I kept on cheating on these setting hens and fooling these setting hens. It was not the right thing to do. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most nonviolent thing to do. But as a little boy, I wanted to be a minister. So one of my uncles had Santa Claus to bring me a Bible. And I learned to read the Bible. So with the help of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard, like you gather here, and I would preach to these chickens. And some of these chickens would bow their heads, some of these chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to during the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. And some of those chickens were just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs. Well, growing up there, when we would visit the little town of Troy, only 10 miles away, 8 to 10 miles away, visit Montgomery, about 48 miles away, I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting, white boys, colored boys, white girls, colored girls. And I would ask my mother, my father, my grandparents why. They would say, boy, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But one day I heard about Rosa Parks when I was 15 years old. I heard about Martin Luther King Jr. I read about Rosa Parks. I read about Dr. King. And I was inspired to get in trouble, what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. So much that Andrew convinced me that this was the thing to do. And with the help of Andrew, Iden, and Nate Powell, we have March, Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3. And it's our hope that March will inspire another generation of young people and people not so young to stand up, to speak up, to be bold, to be brave, and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I was inspired by Rosa Parks, inspired by Martin Luther King Jr., changed my life forever. We study as students, as college students, and many as high school students. We study the way of peace. We study the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. As a college students, we were told that we couldn't sit in at lunch counters, in restaurants, that black people and white people couldn't come together and be seated together on a bus. And we changed that. I got arrested a few times during the 60s, about 40 times. And since I've been in Congress, another 5 times. March, Book 1, Book 2, Book 3 are saying when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to say something. You have to do something. You cannot afford to be quiet. Just think a few short years ago, in our country, black people and white people could be seated together on a Greyhound bus or Trailway bus, leaving Washington, D.C., to travel through Virginia, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We were on our way to New Orleans. There were young white and some older whites and African American and others that was arrested, jailed, and beaten. More than 400 of us were jailed along the way and sent to the state penitentiary in Mississippi. Some for 35 and 40 days. People couldn't register to vote. People were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. We had to change that. And we have made changes, but there's still changes to be made. So we're saying to young people, to students and adults, to teachers, that we all can do something. We all can be informed. I said earlier that it's my belief that it would be the young people, and women in particular, that will help save America and help save the planet. You can do it and you must do it. So study March, study the way of peace, the way of love, study the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence, and never hate, as Dr. King taught us, for hate is too heavy a burden to bear. The way of love is a much better way. One of the people who beat me and beat my seatmate during the Freedom Rise in May of 1961, when I was 21 years old, had all my hair and a few pounds lighter, and left us lying in a pool of blood, came to my Washington office many, many years later with his son. And he said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people that beat you. I've been a member of the Klan." His son came with him. His son started crying, broke down and cried. He said, "But I want to apologize. Will you please forgive me?" He gave me a hug from back. His son His son hugged me, and I hugged him, and I saw the gentleman 4 other times. It's the power of the way of peace, the way of love, the power of the philosophy, and the discipline of nonviolence. So we must never, ever give up. We must never get lost in a sea of despair. We must keep the faith and show not just to ourselves, but to our towns, our city, our state, our nation, and to our world, that we can live together as human beings and lay down the way of separation and division. So I urge each and every one of you to read March, study the lessons, and our country will be better, our world will be better. We do not have to live in conflict. We do not have to be violent toward each other. We do not have to hate. We can be a peaceful, abiding society. We can do it. We must do it. So you're going to listen to Andrew and to Nate. Thank you very much.
How do you follow that? My name is Andrew Iden, and I serve as Digital Director and Policy Advisor to the Congressman in Washington. I've been on his staff for the better part of 13 years, pretty much my entire adult life. And he's been my congressman since I was 3 years old. I grew up in Atlanta. I was born and raised there. My father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant who I never knew. I was raised by a single mother. And it was in that childhood that I fell in love with reading comics. And your dad leaves, you're a little angry about it. And so I started reading comics because it was a place of sanctuary. It was a place where I could read stories about people who were doing the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do. And that's how I got into comics. I think for this generation, though, for you guys, we're digital natives. We grew up on the internet. Tweets, memes. We speak in words and pictures. Visual literacy is our written language. I didn't know that's why it made sense to me at the time. I mean, I grew up in the internet age with the dial-up button. You remember the dung, dung, dung? But, you know, other people recognize that too. That's why it's still incredible to be here. I mean, Joe and Brian and Jenna, everybody from New York City Public Schools Social Studies Department, y'all were the first ones to recognize what it is we were trying to do. And so it means so much to me to be back here with the Chancellor and the Mayor and the Congressman. Let's talk about like an outsized lead up, right? Like I'm a congressional staffer and you're going to put that in front of me? Okay. But you know, that's what's so beautiful about the world we live in right now. And I hope all of the students recognize that that's what you have the capability to do. When I first started talking about March as an idea, it was because I would go to Dragon Con. Yeah, let that set in. I started going when I was 12 years old, right? This is Atlanta's comic book convention. And it was where I felt like I belonged, where I felt like I was part of a community of readers. And I could meet the creators, and I could read the stories, and I could get sketches on the backer boards and everything like that. And that's where I fell in love with the medium. And in fact, years later, when I was working on the Congressman's campaign, it was the summer of 2008, we started talking about how do we teach John Lewis's history? I mean, I had grown up in his district, and yet nobody had told me what SNCC was capable of doing, what SNCC had done for us, the power that the young people wielded during the civil rights movement. And it wasn't until I started serving on John Lewis's staff and heard those stories firsthand that I realized and understood that some of the most radical reforms of the civil rights movement came from the persistence of the young people. Not just the leadership of SCLC or Dr. King, but the people in SNCC and CORE and COFO and all these groups that spread out across the South, engaging in direct action campaigns from the sit-ins to the freedom rides to the March on Washington when John Lewis's speech got him called a young radical, to the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where, and I love this quote. We don't actually use this quote often, but one of the conservative reporters, when John Lewis announced that the SNCC was going to be pursuing the Mississippi Freedom Summer, he called the congressman later and he wrote about it and he said, you know, John Lewis, you may not be a communist, but you sure are acting like one. And I think about that radicalism, right? You hear that today. Oh, you're a socialist. You're a communist. It's called red baiting. And that's why it's so important that we understand the civil rights movement, because so many of the same fights and fissures and struggles that we're exploring today, that we're trying to move forward, are the same fights the civil rights movement took on 55 years ago. We just stand on the shoulders of giants who got us here, who didn't have the resources like social media and technology to organize on the scale that we now have the capability of doing. And that's your sacred responsibility. So when I was serving on this campaign, Congressman told me about a comic book. It's called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. It sold for 10 cents. It was 16 pages cover to cover. It was beautiful. It was an introduction to nonviolence, to civil disobedience, and I became obsessed with it. I went home, I looked it up on the internet, and it turns out it was used in some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience. I even went and wrote my graduate thesis in grad school on the history of this. And you know what? It turned out Dr. King actually helped edit that. Just take a minute. Does that not change your perspective of Martin Luther King Jr., right? Dr. King, comic book editor. It's not one of the titles they put on the statues. But embracing ideas that are ahead of their time was a hallmark of the civil rights movement then, just as it's a hallmark of John Lewis now. And I say that because I know that you all have ideas that people don't understand yet. And your power as a young person, if you read these lessons, if you understand how the civil rights movement used nonviolence and civil disobedience to affect power and affect change, you have the ability to change the conversation, to push the conversation forward, and to bring these great ideas to the forefront. So I bugged John Lewis to do a comic book. And I had to be persistent. He was really sweet about it at first. I would say, Congressman, you should write a comic book. He would say, maybe. Yeah, we got the mayor here. We got all these elected officials. We know what maybe means. That's not supposed to get that hard of a laugh. But that's just it. It's not just enough to have the idea. You got to put in the work. It was 5 years from when John Lewis said, yes, I will do this, but only if you write it with me, to when we actually released that first book. We built a team. We got a publisher. We got Nate, one of the finest comic book artists of his generation. And we worked and we worked. Congressman and I would talk late at night on the phone to work on the script because he has a day job. And sometimes he would fall asleep. Sometimes I would fall asleep. You would just hear this snore on the other end of the line. I'm just kidding, Congressman. You don't really snore. But that's what it takes. And you've got to do it when you're young. I don't think I could have pulled off March now. I'm 36. You want to just be my cheerleader when I go home? I could use that. No, I mean it. I mean, we were working, so I'm on the Hill. I'm working 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, depending on the week. And then we go home on the nights and the weekends and we write this script. Then we're working with Nate, going back and forth with pages, constantly, for years. And that's what it takes. First book came out, everybody thought we were nuts. Everybody. The first question Stephen Colbert asked when he was, is it dignified for a congressman to write a comic book? And it was a fair question. And then it took years of going on the road, going to conferences, speaking to classes, explaining what it was we were trying to do. We're trying to teach young people about their power and how another generation did it. And it wasn't until 3.5 years later that the third book became the first graphic novel to win the National Book Award. So I say all of that to say that you have to be persistent. You have to be consistent. You have to keep pushing and keep fighting, and you can't be afraid to be laughed at. I'm going to tell you this last story. When I was in high school, I used to bring my comic books to class. I would read them. We had a little time. And I got caught with my comic books out on my desk by my English teacher. She said, "You can't have those out right now. Those aren't real books." Well, I got to go back to my high school. And I got to have a very wonderful conversation with that same teacher about her experience teaching our graphic novels in her English class. I offer that story not as any form of comeuppance to the teacher. She was expressing the prevailing wisdom of the time. But I offer it as an example of the power of an idea whose time has come and the brief period in which change is possible. So I ask all of you, join us and march. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, sir. I'm going to keep this super brief so we have more time to discuss. This is your time, so questions you may have, that's the priority. Okay, so I'm from Arkansas. I also grew up in my elementary school years in Montgomery, Alabama, just about 50 miles down the road from where Congressman Lewis grew up. I was born in the late 70s. I'm 41 years old. A lot of the direction my life's path has taken me and a lot of the work that we have produced together is part of a lifetime of reckoning with the same questions, the same contradictions, reckoning with the way that I was brought in and through the world. So I did, thanks to my parents, I did grow up with a very basic working knowledge of the civil rights movement. And I do mean very basic, but it worked for me. However, and this is living in the capital city of Alabama, site of major historical occurrences during the movement itself, whether it was personal anecdotes and experiences that my parents had growing up in Mississippi, or whether it had to do simply with the history itself. Almost every time these lessons in this history would sort of be dialed back just a bit at the end. Just take a bit back, and they'd always be like, "Oh, but that was a different time." So the history we just told you is not this world here. You know, like to use the Jedi mind trick, like these are not the droids we're looking for. And it was really weird to me because, you know, I couldn't put my finger on it at the time because I was 8, but some of the history they were telling me were locations that I had physically already been to that were 3 miles down the road from my house.